Hi everyone. Well, we're up to chapter 13 now. Last week we looked at chapter 12 and we saw that the devil is literally behind everything, and ultimately history is about a war that he has waged, and it's a war between Satan and the church. In chapter 13 we see the two main ways, his main schemes in trying to defeat the church. One is very clear and obvious, and that's through persecution. And the other is very much more subtle and seductive, and that's through deception. And in getting a grasp of that and seeing the way he works through this incredible chapter 13, it'll really help us to know how best to combat him and how best to live our Christian lives in the face of this kind of opposition that we have. This is Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. Let's just read the first 5 verses. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns, 7 heads, and 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon, remember Satan, gave the beast his power and his throne and his great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he'd given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like this beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise authority for 42 months. Remember, we've come across that phrase 42 months several times, whether it's 42 months, 3.5 years, times and a half, or 1,260 days. It's all the same period of time, 3.5 years, which for the Jews would signify times of persecution. Now, we've read that. You've never heard about this happening in history, but don't imagine, therefore, that this is something that's going to be happening in the future. This is not necessarily a prophecy about the future. Most of Revelation isn't. It's highly symbolic, vivid language to help us understand in which way the devil works today. And what we have here is this dragon giving power to the beast, but ultimately the beast then makes it so that everyone is following the dragon, who we know is the devil. It talks in verse 2 about these powerful creatures, a leopard, a bear, a lion. These were animals that Rome and other nations used to symbolize on their crests, on their coins, power. Something about Rome communicated to people invincibility. Hence, in verse 4, the question is asked, who's like this beast? Who can wage war against it? This here is a description of Rome. And this beast that utters words that are blasphemies, proud words, well, as we said before, the Caesars in the 2nd century, in the 1st century, they would claim to be the Son of God. They would claim to be Lord. So they would expect people to say Caesar is Lord and to see them as deities and to worship them. Blasphemies. And the result of this, verse 10, if anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. So this here is saying to the church in the 1st century and to every church that it's in very obvious persecution, that when you're in this persecution, if you're going to go into captivity, you're going into captivity. If you're going to be killed, then killed you will be. This is what's going to happen to the church. But what you need to do, it says, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. This is what was going on in the 1st century for the church. They were being threatened with physical harm. They were being threatened with torture. They were being threatened with jail. They were being threatened with death. Some of them were even losing their lives. And Satan was using this threat to try and silence the church, to try and stop the church. And you can understand how that in some way could be effective. In terms of a current application of that, you wouldn't really say we're in that situation in Britain. You would look more to countries like North Korea, to some extent China, some of the Islamic states. But I'm going to look more in more detail at this second beast from verse 11. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. So this beast now, it says, is coming out of the earth. The other one came out of the sea. Now, in those days, the Jews had this view of the sea as being a place of trouble and a place of danger. And as well as that, the Roman forces came across the Med into Asia Minor to conquer that region. So they saw the sea as an obvious danger. That's why in Revelation chapter 21, when it describes heaven, it says there'll be no sea. That doesn't mean to say there literally will be no sea, but there won't be any sea in terms of it being a figure of danger and potential trouble. And so the second beast is coming out of the earth, not an apparent danger. It had 2 horns like a lamb, so again, not apparent danger, but it spoke like a dragon. We're evidently going to be talking here about deception. Verse 12, it exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. It performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from the heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived, there's that word, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced people, all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and that number is 666. So we're evidently talking about an attack of Satan, which is all clearly about deception, being subtle and being very seductive. And then you have these phrases at the end that people will be forced to receive a mark. And if they don't receive this mark, they can't buy, they can't sell. There's lots of things that they would suffer from as a result of not receiving this mark. And they said this mark would be on their right hands or on their foreheads. Now, people have kind of thought future about how there's going to be this control over the world and subsequently over the church, and whether there's going to be some sort of microchip that's going to be implanted into our hands and in our foreheads, which we believe will give us control over devices and lots of our lives and make life so much easier. But ultimately, then it will actually be a control of governments and ultimately Satan over our lives. Well, you know, I'm not necessarily ruling that out, that something like that can't happen in the future in terms of advancement of technology and so on. But I really don't think this passage here is only applying to some future time where that might happen as technology advances. This is more the principle of what happens to the people of God in every generation. See, this is more about not fitting into society because our principles, practices, morals, and ethics are different. And as a result of being different and not conforming, not joining in, not fitting in, we suffer. So the early church would have looked at this and understood it. They couldn't be part of the trade guilds that existed that helped people to get jobs because the trade guilds were often bound up in the worship of false gods. As a result of that, many people lost their jobs. Many people couldn't buy. Many people couldn't sell because they just wouldn't receive this mark, this fitting in. It's kind of like If you were a Man United supporter, for instance, and you go to watch Man United and Liverpool, but you end up in the Liverpool end and everybody's got their Liverpool scarves on and you've got your Man United scarf on, things aren't going to go well for you. It's that kind of thing in any context, at any time, when the people of God, because they're different, because we won't worship in the same way that other people will worship, because we've got different ethics with regard to sexual morality and so on, we don't just fit in. And as a result of that, we suffer. There are consequences. This number of the beast that's related to this, well, it's 666. It says it's the number of a man. It could well be just something that points to Nero. In Hebrew, in those days, they had a numbering system for each of the Hebrew letters. And the name Nero, in Hebrew numbering, is 666. Now, Nero was seen by the early church. He might well have been dead by this point, and certainly wasn't Caesar, I don't think. But he was seen by the early church as the kind of the epitome of the Antichrist, of the one who was opposed to the church. And so any other subsequent persecution of the church would be seen as a Nero, as a 666. Or it could be, because we're on the theme of deception, it could be kind of like an unholy trinity. So God, the Trinity, you could say, was 777, Father, Son, Spirit, perfection. 7 is the number of perfection. Whereas here you've got the dragon and two beasts, and it's 666. It's nearly 777. It's almost there, looks pretty close to it, but it's a million miles from it in reality. So it could be kind of a number of deception. All right, now let's think about this, because I think in Britain, the way in which the devil works is the second beast. It's through deception, through very subtle and seductive means. We live in a society where increasingly the philosophy, the ethics, and the morals of our day are becoming increasingly unbiblical and anti-Christian. And we imagine in society that we live in a free-thinking society where everyone is free to have whatever views that they want to hold. But that really isn't the case, because there are powerful movements and lobbying groups that exist to redefine how we think about sexual morality, how we think about marriage and roles within marriage, how we think about life both before birth and towards the end of life, how we think about sexual identity and gender. And it's very difficult these days to have an opinion which differs from the increasingly accepted philosophy, moral ethics, and so on, without suffering persecution of some form. Massive pressure to conform and to all have that same view. There was an American soccer player a few years ago who was playing for the USA but didn't want to wear rainbow colours. Not that she hated people who were gay by any stretch of the imagination, but she just didn't feel as a Christian comfortable with supporting that movement. Well, she hasn't played for the USA since. That may just be because she's not good enough, I don't know. But when she played for her club team, after that, they booed her when she came on the pitch, just by making that simple statement, that personal choice. Or take, for instance, someone like J.K. Rowling, who's not a Christian, but several months ago, kind of liked and followed a couple of people who expressed an opinion that there's an importance in our biological sex at birth, as opposed to us choosing the gender that we want to assign to ourselves at some point later based on our feelings. As a result of that, she has been lambasted, she's been rejected and condemned by many of the people who have acted for her. She suffered incredible lengths of online abuse, threats, death threats. A hashtag was trending earlier on in the year, which was hashtag RIP J.K. Rowling. There's a culture now which is called cancel culture. And they exist to cancel, to shut down any view that is a distortion or a variation from their view. So anybody comes out and says something which is against the sort of the increasingly popular opinion, they shut it down. They cancel it. They look to destroy it by any means, and generally through incredibly horrific levels of online abuse. What is it an attack of? Well, it's an attack on freedom of speech, for sure. And people who don't cow to the pressure to conform are attacked. But, ultimately, even though people like J.K. Rowling and others who are not Christians are caught up in it all, I believe that this is an attack of Satan on the church. Satan wants the church to conform to his idea of morality and his idea of ethics, which is obviously going to be anti-Christian and anti-biblical. And there's massive pressure now on the church, isn't there, to kind of look at the Bible and revise it and say, well, maybe it doesn't say what what people used to say in the past, and we want to be popular, and we don't want people to be offended by our views, and we want people to like us if we're going to win them. And so you see more and more massive pressure on the church to conform in all those areas of marriage, of identity, of sexual ethics, of life before birth and towards the end, and so on. And we wrongly imagine as a church that we need to conform so that people will be happy with us, because that doesn't save people. People are not saved when they start thinking that Christians are cool and they're just like them. People are saved when God works through a people who trust him, believe him, follow him, and courageously and lovingly proclaim his unchanging word. And Satan is also seductive. And this is where he's just really, really clever. So much that the church is standing for is being destroyed by seduction. Through 1,000 adverts, glossy magazines, what we may be watching on Netflix or social media promotions. Satan is saying to the nation, but also to the church, this could all be yours if you will only follow me. How many of us are following after the things of this world, and Satan has us, and Satan's destroyed us? So let me ask a question. What are you living for? What do you primarily love in your life? What do you think about? What do you want to achieve most days of your life? Because I think we wrongly assume that because we might do something on a Sunday to do with God and have the odd reading, that means that we're followers of God. We can do that, but we can also be with the majority of our lives going after exactly what the world is going after. And living for the things of the world and living for God is a contradiction. It's an impossibility. We can't be doing the both. So we're either living for God, and that means every day we're thinking about how we can serve God, or we're living for the world. And if we're living for the world, do you know who ultimately we are serving? Ultimately, we're serving the devil, and that's exactly what he wants. It's so seductive. It's so deceptive, but it's important that we see this and realize what's happening and realize how he's weakened the church and how he's destroying the church and the work of God by seductively getting us to follow the rest of society with a little bit of religion on the side. That's fine. He's happy for that, so long as our hearts truly are following him. Let me finish with one story I love. It's about a North Korean pastor who managed to have a meeting with several South Korean and American pastors. And they were saying to him, we're praying for you. We appreciate that the situation that you find yourself in must be awful, with your freedom being taken away and being so poor. And then he said in reply to those South Korean and American pastors, no, we're praying for you. Because you may have your wealth and you may have your freedom. We don't have either of those, but we have Jesus, and we have found him to be sufficient. That's what we need more than anything. You know, sometimes in countries where they're persecuted and they stand nevertheless for Jesus, and they may suffer imprisonment, they may suffer poverty, they may suffer even death. The church is so much stronger because they're living for Jesus. Here we're not suffering that level of attack from Satan, but it's far more deceptive and really far more destructive. May we at the start of every day realize whose side we're on, who we've chosen to follow. May we at the start of every day say, God, help me today. I don't want to be a follower of Satan. I don't want to follow after the ways of the world. I want to live for you. Lord, will you help me to know what that means? Will you claim my heart? I want to love you and serve you with all my heart and my soul and my mind and my strength. And I want you to work through me no matter what, God. Should we pray together? Father, will you help us to understand how the devil may be working in our land, and particularly, Father, how he's looking to deceive even us, your people. Will you help us to be aware of his schemes? Will you help us to be able to stand up, to be courageous, to shine like lights in such a dark, dark nation now, God? For Jesus' sake, amen.